Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. It's Wednesday, April 29th, 2020. In times of crisis, we know that government power always expands because fear is the foundation of most, if not all, governments. And one of the areas where it seems to expand the fastest, or we only learn about what they've been doing years later, is in mass warrantless surveillance. Take the Patriot Act and NSA spying, or the automated license plate reader tracking program that the federal government ran for 8+ years without ever even telling anybody what was happening. So on this episode, we're going to talk about facial recognition surveillance. I'm going to go through 4 major points from a great white paper report that was put out by the Electronic Frontier Foundation. I'm going to encourage you to read that whole report at EFF.org, which I will link to. And the 4 points that I'm going to cover, or do my best to cover from their report, is 1, how facial recognition works. 2, we're going to look at the FBI's massive facial recognition surveillance database that they're sharing with basically everybody. 3, what we might see in the future, not only how they're using it today, but how we expect them to try to use it later on, and it keeps getting worse and worse. And then 4, what needs to be done. I'm going to share some of my own thoughts, kind of off menu from what the EFF recommends on this. But first of all, before getting to it all, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. You can find all the different platforms we're on. We're live streaming through YouTube, Facebook, DLive, Periscope, and Twitch. We have archive video versions at Library, which is run by the founder is from the Free State Project. They're voluntarists and libertarians that run that platform, lbry.tv, I think it is, but I have a desktop app that I use. So Library, Brighteon, run by Mike Adams at Natural News, BitChute, and BitTube.tv. We're also on audio-only podcast platforms like iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, Podbean, Google Play, and elsewhere. You can find all of those channels we're on, all the different ways to watch or listen to the show, all of our archives. I put links in each episode with a description of what's going on so you can read more. Some of them, there's like a list of 10 or 15 links, so there's a lot of information that I'm sharing here. You can find the ways to follow us, social media channels, plus our email newsletter, and even how to support us, like our membership program, which starts out as little as $2 a month. It goes a long, long way here at the TAC. Find all of that at the show homepage and more. 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty, all spelled out. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. I want to say hello to everyone out in the live chat real quick. I appreciate you spending some time with me, and whether you're live or in the archives, if you're leaving comments live or later on, I couldn't be more grateful. In fact, all the comments tell the platform, like, oh, people are interested in this, whether it's controversial or just interesting or whatever, and it tells the platform to show the program to more people, so I appreciate that. And the same goes for reviews on podcast platforms like iTunes. Thank you. So hi to Funky Euphemism, Heather Rossi, Patricia Dance. I appreciate you joining me. Carrie Norris, Tyler B., and everyone else. Michael Bogus, Riv County Fireman, Scott Lashua. Appreciate your feedback and your messages that you've been sending. I really appreciate it. EHP Training, good to see you, buddy. I hope you're doing well down there in Alabama as well. And if I missed you, I apologize. I will check back in the comments a little bit later. Today, I read them all, so I get all the good and negative stuff. So, and the ideas for future shows. I don't get a chance to reply to everything, but I'm very grateful for all of it. Anyways, let's get right to this. And basically, everything that I'm going over today comes from the Electronic Frontier Foundation, EFF.org. They do great stuff on surveillance. And let's first start out with how facial recognition systems work. They say this way: face recognition systems use computer algorithms to pick out specific, distinctive details about a person's face from a photograph, a series of photographs, or a video segment. These details, such as the distance between the eyes or the shape of the chin, are then converted into a mathematical representation. So it's not really, the computer's not seeing it the same way that we do. It's doing measurements and calculations based on how things are shaped and how far things are separated and different marks and things like that. It's converted into a mathematical representation and compared to data on other faces previously collected and stored in a face recognition database. The data about a particular face is often called a face template. And the thing about facial recognition is that even though it's actually can be very inaccurate, and I think a lot of organizations who oppose facial recognition focus only on the inaccuracy, but the nature of the algorithm, I mean, think years ago, if you were shopping at Amazon or something like that, and they provided you a recommended product, there was a time where they weren't really all that good. But if you do some regular shopping on Amazon or any of these other large sites that spend millions of dollars on their algorithms, they generally know everything that you want to purchase next. I mean, they're really pretty good at it. I think the numbers on Amazon were somewhere in the high 90s, something like that. So they get better over time. That's the whole point. Whether they do well for you or not, they've done pretty good for me. Maybe I'm buying too much stuff, whatever it may be. But facial recognition algorithms also improve over time. So if your opposition is based on inaccuracy or racial disparities, you're going to run into real problems in 2, 3, 5, 10 years, 20 years down the line when it becomes so accurate that all of your opposition is worthless now. So you really should base your opposition on the problem with mass surveillance. So anyways, when Scott Lasher was talking about deepfake videos or vishing, it's how your biometrics and videos can be used for malicious purposes. I haven't really followed this closely. I've seen some examples of it, and to me, it's relatively scary. A guy that I watch regularly, a marketing guru, I guess, a guy named Gary Vee, he talks about how at some point in the future, if this happens, he'll just go live 24 hours because he's a public figure, and that way people can't misconstrue what he's talking about. That's, I mean, there's got to be a better solution to that, but that's, I appreciate that feedback, Scott. Thank you so much. So these are using algorithms, and you can see, if you're watching on the video, you can see they show basically a pictorial representation of basically how they're doing this. It takes an individual's picture first, it then locates the eye determinations, it converts it to a grayscale, it crops out all the background so you just have the oval of the head. Then it's converted to a template, and it basically makes these measurement marks along the face, and it's a grid. So then they can compare it to others and figure out which one matches the closest. And every time it gets an error, it learns where it made a mistake, and it's very smart. Skynet is no joke. So they're generally used to do one of three things, EFF tells us. First, a system may be set up to identify an unknown person. Who is this? Well, we know who it is based on their face. Two, it's set up to verify the identity of a known person. They give an example of a smartphone that allows you to use facial recognition to unlock your phone. The first example, identifying an unknown person, basically a cop could use the system to identify an unknown person in footage from a surveillance camera. And then the third type, it operates similarly to a verification system, is designed to look for multiple specific previously identified faces, recognizing card counters at a casino, certain shoppers in a store, wanted persons in a crowded subway platform, or maybe, for example, people attending a political rally, supporting or opposing a different issue, for example. They could be used that way. Surprise, surprise, right? We would never expect that, would we? So going further here, it has a significant impact on what they call civil liberties. I would say natural rights, your right to be just left alone. Let's just call it that. But they put it this way. If law enforcement agencies add crowd, security camera, and DMV photographs into their databases, anyone could end up in a database without their knowledge, even if they're not suspected of a crime. And if you watched or listened to my episode, I think it was late 2018 when I first was really getting into doing the show, I did an episode called The Surveillance State Goes Wild. 2.5 billion was the number. And this was an example of how they're using automated license plate readers, ALPRs, around the country. EFF and Muckrock did a bunch of Freedom of Information Act requests from law enforcement agencies around the country, state and federal. They got about 200. And out of just those 200 agencies, and this is just not a large percentage of all of them, they learned that in 2 years, they did 2.5 billion license plate scans. 99.5% of them, if not higher, had no relationship to any criminal activity, were never suspected of anything. So when they tell you that they're doing this kind of mass, broad surveillance, this blanket surveillance in order to catch criminals, really, that's just, I mean, if you find one criminal out of 1 million or out of 100,000, and that's your excuse to violate the rights of 100,000, don't fall for that, because it's a lie. It's a scam, and that's not how you actually, it's not even a good way to catch criminals. I'm not going to go into that in this episode, but the mountain of evidence makes it much more difficult for them to actually do it. So I don't actually even believe them when they say they're doing this. I believe that they do this to create databases so they can track and trace everyone. So in Georgetown, for example, Georgetown Law does a lot of work on this as well, or Georgetown Privacy Center, I think is what it's called. They call it a perpetual lineup. Basically, if they're using facial recognition on you and they're monitoring public crowds, for example, or public transit, or walking around on sidewalks, whatever it may be, that means you're always in a lineup being suspected of something. And if they're doing the same type of process, they've already done this on license plate readers, billions of scans for the crime of driving existing, going in your car, they're going to track you and see if maybe you're not supposed to be where you are. Just think of how that might be used today. So again, even if they're not suspected of a crime, EFF writes, by being in the wrong place at the wrong time. I think we can all use a little bit of imagination to figure out how this would be used in larger scale capacities, or by fitting a stereotype that some in society have decided is a threat, or by engaging in suspect activities such as political protest in public spaces rife with cameras, which is most everywhere, especially in larger cities. They go further. Given law enforcement's history of misuse of data gathered based on people's religious beliefs, race, ethnicity, and political leanings, Americans have good reason to be concerned about expanding government face recognition databases. And they show some interesting pictures giving examples of how they're actually scanning crowds and picking people out of large political rallies. And that's, to me, that is a big deal, especially if you're talking about protests as well. And they go further. They say law enforcement has already used face recognition technology at political protests that we're aware of. If we already know of them using it in isolated incidents, the odds are they're using it all the time. I don't trust these people. You shouldn't trust government. Government is always going to do stuff as long as they can get away with it. They say marketing materials from the social media monitoring company Geofedia. I had never even heard of this before reading this report. They brag that during the protests surrounding the death of Freddie Gray while in police custody, the Baltimore Police Department ran social media photos against a facial recognition database to identify protesters and arrest them. And from my understanding, it was actually pretty accurate. So let's get on to part two. And I'm just doing an overview. Again, I encourage you guys to read this in more detail. I'm just going through some of the highlights, which I think are very important. And you've heard me, if you've listened to some of the many episodes I've covered on facial recognition, I often talk about the FBI's next-gen database. Again, if I'm comparing it to the license plate reader tracking program, most of the license plates that are being scanned are done by state and local law enforcement agencies. But through something called Information Sharing Environment, this is a post 9/11 Patriot Act type program, Information Sharing Environment, ISE. If a license plate is scanned in Portland, Oregon, or Boise, Idaho, or Billings, Montana, or Tallahassee, Florida, or wherever, it's all sent upstream into a national database or through fusion centers, and then everybody has access to it. It's not just that it's being localized, that the bad government here in California is a problem, and then you don't have to worry about South Carolina or North Dakota or South Dakota or something like that, because it's all becoming one national surveillance state blob. This isn't federalism, because they're all sharing the information, even if they're barely doing it. Or if they're not running the databases, or if they're not running the cameras, they're still having access to the stuff. So they're basically, all the law enforcement in this surveillance state are acting like a national police force. And that the same goes really for the FBI's next-gen system, NGI. This is a massive biometric database that includes fingerprints, iris scans, and palm prints collected from millions of individuals, not just as part of an arrest, but also for non-criminal reasons like background checks, state licensing requirements, and immigration. Think of that. DMV. We know they're trying to tap into the DMV. They have gotten some success on that, and I'll cover that in a moment. but they're pushing for more and more. And we don't even know how far they are, because usually when they do a report on this, the information is lagging a few years. So we can only just uncover stuff as it goes. So we have to just assume that if they've been pushing for an expansion, the odds are they've probably accomplished some of that. EFF goes further. The Interstate Photo System. Who knew an IPS existed? I mean, it's not surprising. I didn't know the name of it. It's part of the NGI and contains photographs searchable through facial recognition. Each of the biometric identifiers in the next generation identification system is linked to, it's not just the photos, they link them to personal, biographic, and other identifying information, and where possible, each file includes multiple biometric identifiers. We know, and if you've heard me talk about this before, when they're doing this type of facial recognition, especially here, LAPD is pretty notorious for this. They'll tag it, sometimes manually, sometimes automatic. They'll tag the location, they'll tag the person's name. It'll get as much information as possible. And the more data they feed into that system, the smarter that Skynet gets. So they go on. FBI has designed NGI to be able to expand in the future as needed, to include emerging biometrics such as footprint and hand geometry, tattoo recognition, gait recognition. They can scan, like if you cover your face, like, oh, we're all putting masks on our face, or a lot of people are putting masks on their face. There's the silver lining in that they can't monitor your through facial recognition as easily as possible. It's illegal in many states to cover your face. Here in California, it's interesting. I looked into the law because someone was asking me about it, because I've been wearing masks out in crowded areas, for example, when I have to go to the store or whatever, and they won't even let you in one way or the other. And so someone was asking, oh, dude, isn't that illegal in California? It absolutely is illegal if the intention is to hide your identity from law enforcement. So it's interesting where there's a high police presence in the area these days to walk over to the market and you're wearing a mask and they're looking at you, and I don't think they're real friendly. But normally they would probably stop you. So at least the silver lining and being able to cover your face, I don't know if they have cameras on top of their car. I know they certainly have automated license plate readers. What other technology can they be using? They also want to use gait recognition. So if they can't match your face, or if there's emerging technology to deflect that type of facial recognition, they're going to look at see how you walk, tattoos and other things as well. So this was all from the FBI system. Going further, covering that FBI system, they've been seeking broader access to external databases, like state DMV databases. They're taking pictures of everybody. They require you to have a license. I mean, I was on a train a few years ago, and on the way home from a job that I had at the time, and these cops got on the Gold Line coming into downtown LA from Pasadena, and there were 20-somethings, whatever. They weren't causing any problems. They were literally just sitting there. And the cops just decided to start checking people's IDs, like papers. It literally was a papers, please situation. And the kid was like, oh, man, I don't have my ID. He's like, it's illegal. And he read some code or whatever. And he said it's illegal to not have an identity document to show the police. It literally is SS-style papers, please. I don't know if that happens real often or if they were just taking a different approach, but they do it. I mean, I've seen it with my own eyes. So if you're required to get one of these documents and then they're uploading the information into a centralized database that anyone in the country can access, and probably they're sharing it with their partners in the Big Five like the UK and others, then that creates another layer of problems. These driver's licenses, right to travel, is a whole nother issue that is related to this. But they've been seeking broader access to DMV databases. They haven't fully gotten into it yet, well, or at least at the time of the GAO report that came out in 2016 and then again later last year. And they've been doing it since before the interstate photo system was even operational, fully operational. The report, they said, disclosed for the first time that the FBI had access, this was in 2016, to over 400 million face recognition images. Hundreds of millions more than journalists and privacy advocates had been able to estimate before that. So they were thinking that it was like 50 million. It just got rolling. I know we had an article on our website that Mike Meharry had done. Basically, all the reports that we could find was somewhere, maybe it was like 40 million, maybe it was 75, but it was tens of millions. And by 2016, it was already 400 million because they were tapping into a number of state DMV databases and other areas as well. And then, of course, we're not even talking about the social media databases, so it's probably much, much higher. They say this number increased to 641 million by the time GAO issued its second report in 2019. And going further, EFF writes, the FBI's Face Services Unit, FACE, they're always really cute with these acronyms like Patriot Act, for example, or ACA, Affordable Care Act. It's always a lie, right? Facial Analysis Comparison and Evaluation Services Unit. I guess that's pretty accurate in that, but it sounds innocuous when you just say the word face. They not only had access to the NGI face recognition database of nearly 30 million civil and criminal mugshot photos, but it also had access to the State Department's visa and passport databases. What a surprise. The Defense Department's biometric database. The driver's license databases of at least 21 states. I like how they actually had to say at least 21 states. I know, for example, Florida in one report, for example, I think the GAO said Florida was not uploading DMV photos to the FBI system. But then a second, a non-governmental agency, I know GAO is somewhat independent, but Georgetown actually did some further research and found out that Florida is in fact doing it. And I'm going to trust the independent researchers who actually want to stop the facial recognition more than the supposedly GAO independent. I don't really know if there's political motivations there, but they're basically saying it's not happening in Florida, so we know somebody else says it absolutely is, or at least has evidence. I mean, some people might say Georgetown is lying, but I'm not going to go with that route. So at least 21 states as of 2019, probably more. This is an unprecedented number of photographs, most of which were collected under civil and not criminal circumstances or stuff. The biggest problem is they don't give you a chance to opt out. Like if you didn't have to get the driver's license, then, and that's a whole nother discussion. You could tell me I'm stupid for that, but the problem is if they're requiring you to do that and then that thing becomes a surveillance tool, as I've talked about covering Real ID, for example, and then they want to turn it into a national ID card and then tag it with certain access capabilities. Maybe you get a little green light. They scan it and say, well, you're allowed to go to this area, you're not. And that becomes a whole nother problem on top of it. Now, they want to expand even beyond this. If this sounds bad already, it's going to get worse. I don't think, and I'm a cynic, although I believe long-term in liberty and privacy and individualism, I think in the short term, it is going to get worse. And see, here are some things in part 3, facial recognition capabilities and concerns on the horizon. They say they're exploring other ways to take advantage of facial recognition. I like that they say take advantage. For example, they've been working with companies like Amazon, Microsoft, and other smaller vendors to incorporate real-time facial recognition capabilities into existing camera systems. So they'll be able to, they don't actually have to have a specific facial recognition camera. The camera, as long as it's feeding the image back through the internet, a central database or a central server or a hub can actually analyze the stuff, and it can be really, really fast. And again, even if it's inaccurate on some people, it certainly is far less accurate on people of color than it is on Caucasian males, for example. It's way more accurate with Caucasian males. Even if it is inaccurate, the fact of the matter is it's happening, and they're really ramping it up. Again, the inaccuracies will only last for so long. They say there is also some indication that the FBI and other agencies would like to incorporate crowd photos and images taken from social media into their databases. And I think they're just being politically correct. I would assume that all this type of stuff is already happening. To what degree, we just don't know if it's official or not. A 2011, if we're going back almost a decade, a Memorandum of Understanding, MOU, between Hawaii and the FBI shows that the government has considered permitting photo submissions independent of arrest. So they already had an agreement with Hawaii to allow this up to a decade ago, 9 years. So the odds that they're actually doing that over the last 9 years, I would say, are incredibly, incredibly high. Now, talking about other databases, they're going to expand this. They are certainly working to make that happen. And EFF says that at some point in the future, FBI may also attempt to populate the database with millions of other non-criminal photographs. The GAO report notes FBI's Face Services Unit already has access to the IPS, the State Department's visa and passport databases, Defense Department's biometric and driver's license databases of at least 21 states. I'm glad that they reiterated that, and it's so important to point out that all this stuff is ending up in there, which means that other stuff that we haven't figured out is ending up in these databases is probably there as well. However, they write, the combined 641 million images in these databases may not represent the full scope of FBI access to face recognition data today. And I think that's a little milquetoast in response. I understand why they have to actually say that, because they can't be as just use as much hyperbole as I'm going to use about it. And it's certainly hyperbole. I am very confident that 641 million is a lowball number of how many images they have access to. When GAO's first report first went to press, this is again 2016, it noted that FBI officials had stated that FBI was in negotiations. They were already in negotiations in 2016 with 18 additional states to obtain their driver's license databases. So that's 39 at least as of, I mean, maybe they didn't get them all. I don't know too many states that are like, well, we don't want to work with the FBI. They generally all want to partner up. It's just a matter of figuring out logistics and maybe greasing the skids with like a cash bonus, something like that. They steal the money from you through what they call taxation. Then they put it through the bureaucracy, and then they bribe the states to partner with these centralized surveillance programs. It's really, really nasty stuff. Even further, I think, oh yeah, here we go. They actually, an FBI paper in 2010, or a presentation, again, 10 years ago, they said they want to use the NGI to track people's movements to and from critical events, like political rallies. Wow. If you're paying attention to any political rallies happening right now, maybe they'll be doing something like this. If they wanted to do it back in 2010, they certainly want to do it now. And it doesn't have, again, it doesn't have to be the FBI. Like the automated license plate reader tracking system that is run by the DEA, another organization that shouldn't exist at all, the DEA in Washington, D.C., a vast majority of the information that they get is actually fed into them, into their databases by state and local law enforcement. So as soon as the cops are showing up at rallies, if they are tapping into cameras, surveillance cameras, existing surveillance cameras, mobile ones, whatever it may be, body cameras as well, that all ends up all over the place. So they said they wanted to use it to track people's movements to and from critical events like political rallies, to identify people in public data sets, to conduct automated surveillance at lookout locations, and to identify unknown persons of interest from photographs. This suggests, EFF writes, FBI wants to search and identify people in photos of crowds and in pictures posted on social media sites, even if the people in those photos haven't been arrested or suspected of a crime. Without a doubt. Again, an understatement, but well done, EFF. I think they actually do a really good job with this. One other thing that they want to do, and I've covered on this show, for example, is that police officers are also increasingly interested in using face recognition with body-worn cameras. And very much like what we call stingray devices, cell site simulator devices, which it doesn't always have to be a piece of hardware. It can be done by software now as well. What that does is it's basically a tool that's paid for by FBI grant programs or Department of Homeland Security, like a JAG program. They hand out all this money for local law enforcement to get these granular surveillance tools. Then the Stingray device actually will spoof a cell phone tower and trick all the cell phones in range. Could be 5,000, could be 50, could be 100, could be whatever number of cell phones are in range of that particular tower, into first connecting to the Stingray, and then it relays seamlessly to the cell tower. So you don't even know, there's no delay, nothing like that. There's no clicking like old school spy movies or anything like that. You have no idea. But that Stingray device then can download all kinds of data from your phone. It can get your location through your IMSI. It knows your communications, your texts, your calls, all that stuff. And then they throw that into a database and they share it through information sharing environment and fusion centers. The same thing can happen through body cameras and facial recognition. It all works through the same process. So they say police officers want to do this. And a lot of times the funding for this comes from federal grants because they just want to help their law enforcement partners deal with the drug war or do more asset forfeiture somehow to protect us or deal with terrorism. These are all the things that we're supposed to be afraid of, and they're just going to save us all. And I'm sure there's more things that we can think of that they're going to protect us from now these days. And protect, I should always air quote that or scare quote. Adding face recognition to body-worn cameras, says EFF, would also undermine the primary original purposes of these tools. To improve police interactions with the public, I never trusted body cameras. I understand why people wanted to monitor cops, monitor unaccountable government agents, but man, I just feel like it's a surveillance. Anytime you add more cameras, what is government going to do with it? Just make it, they're going to take advantage of it. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts. Absolutely, power is always going to grow. People are much less likely to seek help from the police if they know or suspect not only that their interactions are not being recorded, but also that they can be identified in real time or in the future. And one other thing that they added, near future uses of facial recognition may also include identifying people at night in the dark. I did an episode quite a while back talking about thermal imaging to do gun control, for example, that they can actually use these types of tools. But of course, they want to have the same type of thing for facial recognition, maybe projecting what someone will look like later in life based on how they look as a child. If you've done one of these 10-year things, you're feeding data into a system that is probably going to government so they can figure out how you're going to look in the future. And again, doesn't take a lot of imagination how that they're going to use this in a negative way. Or they say generating a photograph-like image of a person from a police sketch or even from a sample of DNA. So this is the types of things that are on the horizon. I think it's all very frightening. It's all very dangerous. It's not good for liberty. And EFF recommends some steps forward. They say, and I agree, legislation may be the best option for addressing these issues because courts are slow to act. I would not rely on courts. Anybody in the privacy world, they spend all of their time doing lawsuits that take years and years and years. And in the end, at best, you get a narrow victory. In most of the situations, they just reject it. And then the technology keeps advancing. So they say San Francisco and other cities in the U.S. have already enacted or are considering enacting bans on facial recognition. I've covered that in previous episodes. I'll see what I can do to dig out some links and include that in the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. But I've covered how a lot of localities, primarily here in California, in the Bay Area, but also in Massachusetts, where they're enacting full bans on government use of facial recognition technology. And that is really a key. California here, for example, put a 3-year moratorium on facial recognition in any mobile devices. And the result of that, and even though it's 3-year moratorium, I think it gets a foot in the door to do more. The reason that it isn't a total ban is that most of the opposition to it was based on inaccuracies in racial issues. And I think because of that, that gave the legislators the political cover that they needed to say, well, we don't need to fully ban this. We just need to give it 3 years to do better. So now they're going to have to change the whole opposition. It may have screwed up for the long run, but we'll see. The short run, and I did cover this in a previous episode, as a result of that, San Diego, which had probably the largest body camera and other facial recognition for cops in the country, the system, it totally shut it down. So it's done as of this year, and I'm assuming they want to bring it back. They're just waiting. So 3 years is not, it's going to go fast, and they're really going to, the people who are opposing this here in California are really going to have to change their tune and push for a permanent ban. So these are some of the things that have happened. I'll include some links to previous episodes that have covered this. And EFF says that legislators and regulators considering limits on the use of face recognition should keep the following 9 principles in mind to protect privacy and security. I am not going to cover these because I think they're generally a little milquetoast. You can read them. Some of them overlap with the few that I want to share here. But I wrote down a few notes of things that I think really need to happen. And whether you're working on a state level or a local level. I think it's much easier to work on an individual, a city or a county level to get these types of things done. First of all, the number one goal is to ban it. Ban it completely. It is not possible. And we're not talking about the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution for the United States in the Bill of Rights. Every state has an almost replica version of that, or even better, in their own state constitution, in their own state Bill of Rights. So violating the state constitution, it is not possible to do facial recognition of a crowd and follow the norm of a warrant based on probable cause, particularly describing the person or place or thing to be searched or seized. It's just not possible. So the goal is, really, the end goal is to ban completely. I also follow Thomas Jefferson's advice when it comes to gaining liberty, as he told the Reverend Charles Clay, I think. I forget it. I mentioned this letter, 1790, over and over. He says the ground of liberty is to be gained by inches. And when we're talking about pushing back against the largest surveillance state in history, something that Stalin would have drooled over, the largest government, the largest empire in the history of the world, there's no way to get this all done at once, but we have to keep the ultimate goal in mind. If we're willing to just be like, well, we can just be kind of wimpy about it and then be okay with that, that's not going to get things done. So the goal has to be to totally ban this stuff. But you can't always get that done in one fell swoop. So I think there are some other small steps that can be taken. For example, ban funding for facial recognition systems, or make sure that it can only be used with a warrant based on probable cause, and particularly describing the person that's going to be searched. Because then if you do that, then of course you're going to get a lot of law enforcement opposition, because they're going to tell you, well, we're not able to do that. Or, well, we don't. Really what they'll tell you is that they don't need it. You're in a public space, so they can search whatever they want, whenever they want. But the fact of the matter is requiring a warrant means they won't be able to use it in the way that they want to use it. 3, I think limiting the data that can be collected, the amount of data. So the less data that they have, the less that's shared. That's a very small step. And the less the sharing happens, the less that the whole surveillance state grows. Or just limit sharing, restrict or ban the sharing. If they're going to do this type of stuff, you're not allowed to let it out of the state. That's small steps. The goal, of course, is to ban it completely. Now, one example, we actually ran a report this morning from Mike Meharry. It turns out in New York State, this was a surprising change. But New York State literally just banned funding for facial recognition technology in schools because schools are trying to turn into surveillance states. I mean, they look like prison camps already. It's forced, this government schooling, and they're indoctrination centers. It's another reason to end government schooling. But, and I think, I can't think of his name. Brian Kaplan, I think, is the guy who actually has done a lot of good work on this. But someone will correct me in the comments if I got the name wrong. But and I'm not sure exactly when it happened, but Mike writes, the New York State Education Department has blocked schools from using a state funding mechanism to purchase facial recognition systems because they're doing it. They're turning these schools into surveillance nightmares and getting the kids early. And here from the New York Civil Liberties Union, Stephanie Coyle said, this change is huge. She says, without this state fund reimbursement, we expect that school districts will forego inaccurate and biased biometric surveillance systems and instead invest in instructional technology that improves outcomes for New York's students. It's not really what I would say about it, but I get where they're coming from. Like, look, if you're going to have this school, why are you spending money on surveilling the kids? So this is a very positive thing in New York. As I mentioned, we've done a number of other episodes where I talked about some of these localities, the California body cam ban and others. And once things are back to normal-ish, I'm sure, who knows when this is all going to happen. But once we can actually start pushing forward on some of these efforts, I expect to see a lot more in the near future. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't pull that link up that I was reading along there. I will include that in the show notes for those of you following along. I just want to take a quick look at the live chat. I probably am not going to have a lot of time to answer this. Scott Lashua points out that Massachusetts supports Real ID, which is facial recognition. Absolutely. This is part of that entire system as well. Fascists ruin everything, said the Salt Laker. Seems that sometimes all we can do is laugh. It is a dark kind of comedy that we're living in. And I think, if the future has liberty for the people, if people have individual liberty sometime in the future, we certainly aren't there right now. I would hope, and maybe this is my optimistic side, I would hope that they would recognize that even though government will always expand, government doesn't expand unless the people let it happen. So I think we all know who to blame. It's that great line in V for Vendetta. If you want to know who to blame, all you need to do is look into a mirror. Not saying that every single person that is here with me, like, I don't want to say it's my fault, but in some ways, as long as we keep giving money to politicians and organizations and voting for people that will support this type of thing, it's not going to stop. At some point, the lesser of two evils isn't going to be a good strategy. Well, it already is not a good strategy anymore. William Gallerno says Michigan allows you to opt out of the Real ID unless you have a CDL. I apologize if I got your name wrong. I probably did. And I covered this recently. There's a silver lining out of this whole emergency situation that we're all in right now. The Real ID Act was again delayed another year. Here in California, we had another kind of option like you did, William, in Michigan, to be able to choose one or the other. Now no one has to do that for at least another year, and they keep backing that up. But that is also a very nasty facial recognition surveillance tool. Well, hope you guys found this interesting. I hope you're learning something. I'm learning quite a bit as I go through, especially on this surveillance stuff. And I'm really grateful for all the good work over at EFF.org. I do encourage you to read through that full white paper. There's not going to be a lot of links in the show notes on this episode because I basically just went through 4 main parts of that report, but I do encourage you to read through that if you have some time to do so. If you support the show, please consider a membership. I see a number of you guys out there who have been members, some new ones, and there's a couple of you that I've seen already that have been around for years, and I'm very grateful for that. Don't feel obligated. I know it's difficult for a lot of people economically right now because of how the government has been destroying the money. The government has been printing and doing bailouts and all this stuff. They've created so many problems for us. So I understand if you're not able to, but if you can, our memberships start out pretty cheap. They're as little as $2 a month, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. We make it go a long way. And of course, if you can't do that and you want to help us out for free or do both, smash the like button, subscribe, leave reviews on podcast platforms, comments, all that stuff tells the platforms to show the program to more and more people. Well, again, I appreciate you joining me today. I hope you learned something. I hope you enjoyed the episode. I hope you are safe and healthy and happy and stocked up and all that other good stuff. And I'll see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.